Melody, expecting a response via message, was surprised when all of a sudden a black door began to emerge in front of her, coalescing shadows beginning to solidify, whirling as they took the form of a doorway, a solid black wood door. And just as quickly as it formed, Melody began to see the knob turning and the door itself opening, and striding through the doorway, what looked like the interior of a home on the other side, was none other than Melody's mother, Vera. It had been a great deal of time since he'd seen her mother, and she did not know of the spell that she cast in order to appear before her. She must have added it to her collection since their parting. As Vera stepped through the door, she began to look around at her surroundings, seeing the trees, the grass, a few birds flying through the sky, her eyes simply wandering about and taking everything in, before finally settling on Melody. Her mother's expression was stony, seeming unmoved, but then again, that was usually her mother's temperament. Wearing a somewhat fashionable black dress, long black hair, now with streaks of gray beginning to run through it, which was new to Melody, but it did make sense. It had been some time since he saw her mother, and time was beginning to take its course. She did look somewhat older, a little more wearied, but still did her best to maintain a sense of decorum, an air of regality, you might say, which was also common of her mother. She always wanted to be of a higher class, and so she acted as such. At that point, Vera began a slow pace towards Melody. Still, that very serious and lackluster in emotions expression, the only thing she seemed to exhibit, as she stepped directly in front of Melody, looking her up and down. Melody's clothes now in somewhat better condition than when all of this first began all those years ago, but far from high class. After all, she had only learned to sew so that her and her son could have clothing. But it was function, not fashion, and something that she simply had to get good at on her own. There were no others there to instruct her, so her clothes were far from elegant, but they functioned. "So, how long have you been living out here?" Vera said, turning away from Melody for a moment to stare at the mountain nearby. "You've come quite far from the village, and it has been some time since we've spoken. So, everything else aside, it is nice to see you again, Melody. I have long lamented the way in which we parted, and hoped that one day you might come around. However, the scenario in which you described in your message to me was not something that I wished. I had hoped that perhaps I would be wrong, that even if your husband did discover your magic, that he might come to accept it as he accepts you. So I am genuinely sorry for the way things must have worked out for you to be here. Regardless of anything else, I simply wished to see my daughter. I do not know if I can help with this situation you find yourself in, but I should like to see this adopted child of yours, and perhaps you could explain to me why they are unable to use magic, and why you have yet to bear any other children. I suppose it will take time to receive these answers, a long story that must be told, but if you are willing to tell it, then I am willing to hear. Perhaps we could do so at wherever it is that you call home, somewhere that we might be more comfortable, and that I could perhaps meet this adopted child of yours. I may have some information, but it all depends on circumstance. For a few moments, Melody simply sat there, standing in place, baffled that her mother actually showed up. Not just returned a call, but traveled all the way here, even if it was eased with magic that allowed her to simply summon a doorway. The fact that she came actually made Melody quite happy. She loved her son, and he kept her good company, but she did yearn for connection with others, and being able to re-establish her relationship with her mother was something that brought a sense of joy to Melody's heart. "Yes, Mother," Melody replied. "I've been living over in this direction. Me and my son have made a home for ourselves here, somewhere where we will not be bothered by the hatred consuming the outside world and their judgment, somewhere that we are safe. I have made it quite comfortable there, and my son is named Talion, and I would love for him to meet his grandmother," Melody said, a small smile on her face, feeling happy to be speaking to her mother again, especially after all of this time. "Very well then, Melody. Let us adieu to your house, where we can be more comfortable. Perhaps you could tell me some of your story along the way." "Yes, of course, Mother," Melody replied, as she turned around and began to lead her mother back towards their small home, beginning to fill her in on the gaps in her knowledge, the exchange between her husband and the townspeople, her fleeing into the woods, only to find a shadowy figure about to do away with a mere infant, of saving it and adopting the child as her own. After which, Melody began to simply tell her mother of her life since then, of the joys of being a mother, raising her beloved son, Talion, the games they would play, the things that she's taught him, the joys that she's experienced. And Vera seemed open to it all, listening intently to everything that Melody said, as they made their way through the thick woods back to the house. As they approached the small home, Vera began to look it over, seeing the craftsmanship that her daughter had put into it. There, pressed into the side of the mountain, a small home, the entrance sealed with a mixture of wood and stone, mortar created to affix the stones that seemed to be fairly well cut, and what appeared as if it were a tree that were overgrown, jutting out of the side of the mountain above the entryway, forged of solid wood that grew in an obviously unnatural way. It was clear to Vera that this was the result of Melody using magic to control the growth of this tree so that she could make it serve her purposes of creating a nice entryway to her home that was comfortable and sealed off from the outside.